Hello out there, I'm Morpie and this is episode 2 of Stuff That I Can Ramble On About. Endlessly, pretty much. Got a lot of stuff to cover. This could end up being a long one, so let's get into it. This is the episode on naval combat. And in the first episode, I did talk quite a bit about submarines and what I'd like to see from those, and then promised that I would expand that discussion more into naval combat in general. So that's what I'm going to do. Have a lot of notes to get through. Let's go. First, there are two concepts that we need to go over. Time and distance compression. Now, this is an issue because War Thunder is trying to be both a flight simulator and a ground combat simulator and a naval combat simulator. And traditionally, these types of platforms have handled time and distance compression in different ways. Now, both time and distance compression are basically intended to achieve the same thing. They're trying to prevent having long periods of boredom within games. The way that distance compression works is that it will represent your environment, let's say, in a way that puts key locations closer together so that you don't have to waste as much travel time getting between the two of them. Time compression keeps the perceived distances as real as possible, so, hundreds of kilometers maybe, miles for you Americans, but it gives you the option to speed up time so that you travel these distances in a much quicker way. Now, traditionally, the more hardcore flight sims try not to do either, or at least default to not doing either. So, for instance, a Microsoft Flight Simulator, where you can basically take off, in Seattle, if it were, and then fly to Sydney. The default way of achieving that is to fly a plane for 14 hours. If a game compresses time, then it's going to give you the option of, say, 2 times, 4 times, 8 times, 16 times, sometimes 32 times, time enhancement, so that you can cut that 14 hours down to something that's a much more manageable period, because, let's face it, the majority of the flight from Seattle to Sydney, you're not actually doing anything. Now, in distance compression, it might say you might fly from Seattle to Sydney, but it would put Sydney maybe where Los Angeles is, right? So you have a much shorter distance, something that you can still achieve in, well, I don't know what that flight takes, say 2 hours, give or take, much faster obviously than the 14 hours. So this is the first issue, because what War Thunder does is it compresses distance. And you've probably seen that if you've ever been flying in the game and you've wondered why you can see from the air 6, 7, 8 different airfields scattered around the landmass, of which only 2 are actually in use, and those 2 are basically only 25 kilometers apart. That is distance compression. Now, all of the naval combat tactics type games that I've played, so I'm talking sort of games like Silent Hunter, the submarine game, Dangerous Waters, their basic function is to compress time rather than distance. So, the speed of maneuvering, the act of maneuvering in combat happens in real time. That's the part that they want to replicate. But basically, the getting from point A to point B, that's the bit that they just want to speed through as quickly as possible. Now, not saying that's not compatible with War Thunder, only that it's going to be an issue that we need to think about when we're talking about bringing naval combat into this format wherein time is not compressed. A plane will roll and bank and turn and climb in a more or less realistic sort of period of time, but that the distances are squeezed much more closely together. If you have a ship, like say a giant battleship, that takes 5 or 6 minutes to make a 180-degree turn, and I'm just guesstimating that, I don't really know how long it takes for a battleship to turn, but you can see what the problem is. You're going to be doing nothing but turning your ship around for 6 minutes. Meanwhile, a quarter of the match is past. And this is also something which is going to affect the ground combat, the tank combat, because you couldn't have the tanks starting off at the opposing airfields, for instance, when they're 25 kilometers apart. They're going to take, the whole time allocated for that one match just to cross that distance and find somewhere to meet up in the middle. So the advantage is that because War Thunder already distance compresses, it puts these airfields much closer together. It's also very easy for them to distance compress the area in which the tank combat plays out. They can make that one town, two towns, one small, relatively small zone, and then include that within the larger overall scope that the aircraft are playing within. Very easy to do. Bit more difficult to integrate that then with the naval combat. Now, the other reason that this is a problem, potential problem, issue, whatever you want to call it, for the naval combat, is that you're talking about these weapons platforms with extraordinary ranges. There are guns, I think the 8-inch guns on the large battleships, for instance, not the biggest, not the 11 inches, but the 8-inch ones. Some of these could fire 25, 30 kilometers away. So there's almost nowhere on a current map where you could put ships in the water that they couldn't just sit there firing on any other point of the map. So if you distance compress that, i.e. you make the range of the ship's gunnery much more limited, you can achieve the kind of effect that you want, but then you're throwing out the balance that you have going with the tanks and the aircraft, because presumably their weapons are operating on a much more realistic kind of compression system. And then suddenly you arrive at the naval combat where there's a whole new compression system, potentially. That's one of the issues that I think we need to kind of keep in mind as we go through this process. The other basic concept that I wanted to get into was the types of player that potentially are going to be playing War Thunder. At the moment, the game is pitched mostly at the more action-minded player. But you've also got players who have, and I'm one of them, who have an interest that's more in the strategic combat than the sort of the direct action. I'm terrible at FPS games. I can't aim for crap. I have the same problem in World of Tanks, in War Thunder. God, I don't even play World of Tanks. So I have that same issue. I'm pretty bad with my aiming. It takes me quite a long time tracking a target to finally get it down. But what I love about War Thunder is the strategy and the tactics involved in achieving the end goal of the mission, which for the most part, let's face it, is basically to shoot down the enemy planes and stay alive. But as we progress further, it's going to be much, much more involved. The targeting of ground targets from the air, the combat that's going on the ground with the tank combat, all of that stuff being integrated is going to have a much broader strategic or tactical kind of focus, and I'm so looking forward to that. That type of player is ideally suited to the naval combat. This is, the more action-focused players, the people who like to get into the thick of things and just shoot stuff, you're covered. You've got your planes, and to an extent you've got your tanks as well. So you're not at a loss for things to point guns at and blast away at. The more slow-paced, strategically minded players, the type of player who might, for instance, play Commander mode in Battlefield 2 or in Natural Selection 2, those type of individuals are going to have, potentially within the naval combat, these powerful, very slow units that will benefit from that strategic thinking, from having good positioning, from providing excellent support to the other roles that are being fulfilled by the more action-oriented kind of players. So that's something else that I want to keep in mind, because I am all of my thinking, like all of what I would like to see from naval combat, is basically focused on this idea of naval combat being for, the more slow-paced strategic thinkers, because the more fast-paced, action-oriented players, they've got their stuff. They're going to be covered. It's not like they're going to be short of things to do within the game. And just briefly, I guess there's the third kind of player which is worth thinking about, and that is the simulator enthusiast. And these are the people who are going to be playing, full real battles. They're using War Thunder as an alternative to a game like IL-2 Sturmovik. They want, in as much as it's possible, the most authentic combat experience. And I think that can and should extend to a tank combat experience, to a naval combat experience, as much as that can be achieved. There's no reason why we can't, but there are going to be a few issues, and I'll get into those a little bit later on. So, naval combat. A quick recap. What do we know about the potential for naval combat already within the game? And once again, I want to do a shout out to BaronVonGames, who did a fantastic video covering all of the screenshots, all of the naval units that are currently within the game, a discussion of all of these and their various roles. So I don't want to rehash that same material because he did such a great job on that. But let's just go over it quickly. What do we got in the game right now? We have our patrol boats. We've got our destroyers. We've got cruisers and light cruisers. We've got battleships, and we've got aircraft carriers. And to that list, I would very much like to add, I want submarines. Please, 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 can I have submarines? I did a whole episode number 1, about just that. Now, your patrol boats, they're presumably, like in the map Crater, going to be fast, low draft boats. One of the strengths of them could even be the fact that they have river access, or could have river access. Your destroyers in this case are going to be faster, but let's call it medium speed, mainly naval combat. They could be divided potentially into different subclasses, like, for instance, submarine hunters, anti-air pickets, perhaps, like anti-air radar pickets. My line of reasoning with the destroyers would be that these should be ships that are capable of doing one thing well, right? So you can give them a specific role within the game, and their tonnage is quite well suited to that. They can have decent speed and decent maneuverability. They can have a bit of air defense. They can have a little bit of, sea to ground weaponry, for instance. But they will have a specific role to play, and they will do that one thing well, but not necessarily many other things well. So, for instance, an anti-air radar picket would be fantastic as a unit to include in a small fleet to provide the best air cover that can be provided by a unit in the game. A lot of anti-air guns, the onboard radars to assist in targeting those aircraft, providing, whatever map status updates could be provided to other units within that small fleet, that sort of thing. The same idea with sub-hunters. These would be destroyers, units that would excel in finding submarines if they're in the game. Please include them in the game. And tracking them down, destroying them with depth charges. I don't know. Maybe that's not your thing. Maybe you don't want to play that. I kind of do. Next, you've got your cruisers, and I'm going to include the light cruisers in this. Now, what I would like to see from these would be a type of unit that can do multiple things pretty well. Nothing brilliantly, but it's got all your bases covered. So you've got really quite strong air defense, you've got quite strong ground attack capability, You've maybe got the electronic suites that on board that are necessary to track subs and to track aircraft. So it does a little bit of everything, does it quite well, is slower in speed, is slower in maneuvering, and obviously is a bigger target for somebody to hit with a bomb. Now, the other thing that you could do with cruisers, or let's say with light cruisers, is create landing ships out of them. And I'm thinking something along the lines of the LSD, the dock landing ship, or the LSV, the vehicle landing ship. Something along the lines of the Casa Grande or Ashland class ships, which are around 8,000 bare metric tons, and that's the equivalent of a light cruiser. So they would slot in quite well there, and for comparison's sake, destroyers are around about 2,000 to 3,000 bare metric tons, so you're looking at about a half or less the weight of a light cruiser, certainly significantly less than a full cruiser. Next, you've got your battleships. Now, these are going to be obviously the slowest speed, really focused on just blowing the hell out of stuff, whether that is other naval units that they could be engaging, or whether that is to just decimate, like a ground area. I'm thinking something along the lines of the artillery in World of Tanks, which, again, although I haven't played that game, I've seen it on Jingle's channel. So, you might select a target area, and depending on, and I'm thinking now on the ground, on the land, you'd select this target area, and depending on whether the units that occupy it are stationary, or whether you're able to sort of judge a decent lead for your bombardment, you could really do an incredible amount of damage to quite a large area. And it's death from above potentially, but it's really going to change the techniques that the ground-based players are going to have to use if there's this potential that, if the enemy team knows exactly where they are and there's a battleship within 10 kilometers of them, they do not want to be sitting in the one place for any length of time. Aircraft carriers, the last unit that we know already exists in the game. Not quite sure how they'd play out, but they could be very powerful command and control units. Potentially they could launch squadrons of AI fighters. They could also potentially be a launch location for player-controlled aircraft. Sort of an extension of the respawn system like we have now. Finally, there's the submarines, and I don't want to get too much into those because, like I said, I did a whole episode on that. Also, I want to reiterate, we don't know that there are submarines in the game. I just think it would be a really good idea for them to be there. I don't necessarily subscribe to the arguments that I've seen along the lines of, subs being OP or not suitable. I think they're eminently suitable, and I've described exactly why. But there are interesting things that you can do with them. All of the countries that are represented within War Thunder had submarine development programs. Some of them you don't hear about. Some of them did quite quirky kind of things. For instance, the Japanese had an aircraft carrying submarine, the I-400. The Russians had some quite good submarines, but they suffered from the fact that they couldn't get them out of the Baltic. The German Navy had control of the Baltic. So you don't tend to hear about the Russians engaging in much submarine combat, basically, I think, from, poor strategic thinking. The Italians had submarines. They had, interestingly, a really, really large transport submarine called the R-class, 600-ton cargo-carrying submarine. So there's interesting things that you can do with those tech trees if you're of a mind to include these sorts of weapons. They can fill some very interesting roles within the game. Next, and actually, I don't know if you heard that, but I just clapped my hands like, next, let's get into this. So, weapon categories. Now, I haven't really gone too much in depth into sort of researching different naval weapons and what they do, so let's just talk broadly. Firstly, anti-air. I mean, anti-air in any naval combat is going to be vital simply because the majority of the game as it stands now, is based around air combat. I'm expecting this with ground combat, and I'm expecting it with naval combat, because the sort of tactical doctrine, let's say, of the air combat within the game has been worked out so thoroughly. I think we're going to find initially on release that the ground units, that the naval units excuse me, are going to be seriously outclassed on the initial release, simply because they haven't yet had that chance to be balanced well against the existing category of vehicles, which is aircraft. So, anti-aircraft guns, and I'm going to roll in a little clip here into the background of some real-life anti-aircraft guns in action. All I really want to say about this is that I think we've all raged about the sort of destroyer snipage that happens. You know, you're flying along, everything's just gravy, and then suddenly this shot from a destroyer 5 kilometers away just decimates you. I hate that as much as the next guy. But, to be fair, these ships aren't bristling with anti-aircraft guns in the way that they potentially should be within the game. Imagine, for instance, if one of the cruisers was basically, or had sort of the anti-air equivalent of an airfield, right? So you've got a whole bunch of fast-firing machine guns, of flak guns, all going off, and all of this fire is coming from a single ship. That's really what you'd be expecting to see. Now, obviously we don't, because it would make the ships in the game as they stand completely unapproachable objects. They would decimate aircraft. But as soon as you transition across to a system where the accuracy of this gunnery, where the degree of this gunnery, where just like we have with aircraft, the shell selection types, where all of these are player selected and controlled, it's very much going to change the dynamic. So I would much rather see a large volume of fairly inaccurate fire, certainly inaccurate at lower levels, coming from these ships than, you know, a single 88mm shell which is just sniper rifle accurate that's going to take you out. You know, the rage-inducing sort of event that I think we've all experienced. And of course that fire could be coming potentially from a variety of different calibers. So a single ship could have 88mm flak guns, as well as a whole bunch of different types of machine guns that would be engaging incoming aircraft at their own respective engagement ranges. Now, in addition to the anti-aircraft guns, the main type of naval combat weapon that we're going to be encountering is going to be the cannons, the big guns on the ships. And for the destroyers, we're going to be looking basically at these sort of the 5-inch guns. Cruisers might be a bit larger, they're potentially up to the 8-inch guns, and on the battleships you can have these enormous guns, 14-inch, this is in width, 14-inch shells being fired from these gigantic things. If you've ever been on a battleship, it's just astonishing how big these guns can get. Interestingly enough, the biggest guns aren't necessarily the furthest firing, and that's simply because of the weight of the shells that they're firing. They can't lob as far as I'm aware, a 14-inch shell 25 kilometers, but there are certainly ships that can lob an 8-inch shell 25 kilometers. And the key idea for me in thinking about all of these guns, you know, you're talking about the anti-air flak guns, anti-air machine guns. You might have say a cruiser that's got a range of 5-inch guns on it and a range of 8-inch guns on it. This is an insane amount of guns for a single vehicle. How are we going to control all of these guns? You can't just have, like tail gunners in a bomber currently, this single viewpoint that you swing around and engage at things with, and that any gun which is capable of angling in the direction that you're facing would then be shooting, and any gun that's not is just all on its own AI controlled. There's going to have to be some kind of weaponry management which is more involved than just pointing at a target and clicking furiously to try to kill it. My preference would be for something more along the lines of, or say, multiple targeting of different units. So say you're sailing an anti-air picket destroyer. Okay, you've identified an incoming flight of enemy aircraft that are potentially going to be deadly to you or to the other naval units around you. Now you might be able to sort of prioritize a list of targets based on your knowledge of those targets, what they are, what their respective armaments are, how big of a threat they pose, and then allow the AI to take on these targets in sequence so that they focus on the threats that you've identified as being greatest. All of the other normal stuff within the game will come into that in terms of your crew training, the experience of the different weaponry officers, an issue which I'll get into a little bit later on, namely the provision of a stable gun platform. But all in all, that's really how I'd like to see these things being managed. You, as the player, can always take control of a specific gun or a specific gun battery, and you'd then have that fine control. You could engage very specific targets. So, for instance, having assigned your threat levels to the incoming aircraft, you might then leave the actual gunnery to your AI while you focus on maneuvering the ship, because there are also surface threats, or while you focus on engaging a surface threat with cannons, although presumably you're not going to have much in the way of cannons in a picket. You might choose to jump in one of the more powerful anti-aircraft guns yourself, for say an 88mm flak gun. If you think, I'm really quite deadly accurate with these flak guns, I'm going to focus on this one torpedo bomber that I can see, and I'll let my AI gunners sort of whittle down the incoming fighters that are with them. That would be, for me, the ideal sort of order of battle in which you would have that sort of tactical control of saying, these are the targets that are important to me, you guys work on that, I've got other stuff to do, and you can be in and out of that as much as you like, reassigning targets, engaging different targets yourself, maneuvering. That just seems fantastic to me. I love that idea. I mean, just imagine this scenario, for instance. You're driving a battleship. You've got one of the most powerful units in the game. Now, you're trying to set up effectively an artillery bombardment of some kind of ground target, be it a small town or a major road that you believe an enemy tank column is going to be passing through. So while you're trying to focus and set up on this ground target and get just enough lead, knowing that it's going to take your shots a long time to cover this 10, 12 kilometers distance, in the meantime, you know that there are enemy aircraft above your ship trying to kill you. Okay, so you're in the artillery selection screen, knowing constantly in the back of your mind that your anti-aircraft gunners are working their asses off, your gun batteries may be engaged with surface targets at the same time. So you don't have, or you potentially wouldn't have, the luxury to just sit there in the artillery screen choosing the absolute perfect moment, because you've got another battle that's going on that you have to get back to, and you've got to get back to it as quickly as possible. And that just seems to me this sort of balance of the strategic elements with the action elements. It seems like a role that naval combat is just made for in a game like this. And that's really where I personally would love to see the focus. Now, the next weapon type that I wanted to talk about a little bit was the torpedoes. And at the moment, I really, really don't like the torpedoes. I think they're really weak. They don't make a lot of sense. I think you've probably had the same experience that I have, that you're dropping torpedoes normally at around about 500 meters. You're pointing at or just in front of the nose of a ship that's moving, or ideally you're going to be picking the ships that are actually stationary because they're much, much easier to hit. So torpedoes, as it stands, are really poorly thought out weapons, but they don't have to be. They can be so much more interesting. I mean, firstly, what I'd like to see is target lead indicators, like we have for aircraft. And don't rage against me just yet, hear me out. Imagine you select a ship that's moving, okay? You get a target lead indicator, and you can potentially drop your torpedo from 2 kilometers away, and with that lead indicator, have a reasonable indication that it's going to hit the target. And we'll get into other factors in a sec. That would then be, like lead indicators are now, a function of the arcade mode. But the huge advantage is you could use those indicators just like we use the aircraft indicators to learn how to lead targets, to learn what kind of lead on what kind of ship size and speed we need to be giving these things, because at the moment there's just no indication at all, and it can be really awkward trying to hit a target while being chased by enemy fighters and while having these destroyers trying to snipe you out of the sky. It's just not really an effective strategy. Another factor that would come into play is that torpedoes do have minimum arming distances, and right now we're generally dropping them well within the minimum arming distance. So realistically, they'd be hitting the target and doing nothing at all because they wouldn't even have armed yet. So we should be firing these things from a lot further away. But you can't fire them from far away or drop them from far away, because then you're extremely unlikely to hit. That's why I want to see lead indicators in the arcade version of this game, so we can learn, we can get that feel for where the torpedoes need to go. And really, how hard can that be? It would work basically the same as aircraft work. You select your target, which in this case would be a ship. You're approaching it from the side, obviously, or maybe not obviously, but the ideal angle is from the side to give yourself the biggest target possible. And somewhere off the bow of that ship would be this little pipper, this little indicator that, you know, this is where you want to be pointing right now and dropping this torpedo if you're going to hit. And then as you get closer and closer and closer, that lead indicator is also going to move closer to the target. Might seem a bit overpowered for the game as it stands now, but again, I'm trying to project into the future more. So right now we have these AI ships that basically only travel in a straight line, and yeah, having a lead indicator is going to make them way easy to shoot, like seriously easy to shoot. But that's okay, because as soon as we transition then into the naval combat, where these ships are controlled by players, you might have a lead indicator and you might be dropping your torpedo from a much more realistic 2 kilometers away. That ship has time to maneuver, and any commander worth his salt is going to see this low-flying aircraft, maybe even see the torpedo dropping into the sea, and have some idea of what he's going to need to do within the next minute or so in order to present a much smaller and potentially less successful target to that incoming torpedo. The other thing that's worth considering when looking at torpedoes is that in a real-life context, slower is better. In making a torpedo bombing run, there is an ideal speed to drop that torpedo, and it's as close as possible to the torpedo's attack speed, which is generally slower than any aircraft that you're going to be carrying them on, with the possible exception of maybe a swordfish. So that's a battle tactic to which we then need to adapt. Again, something that's affected, or in this case not affected, by the lead indicator. So you're approaching a ship, you're 2 kilometers away, the lead indicator says that you've got to drop this torpedo at this particular sort of point, left to right. And you do. But if you're going at 300 kilometers an hour and that torpedo is impacting the water at that speed, it's also introducing a much greater variance, deviation, let's say, on the initial target plot. So the further you are away and the faster you're going, the less accurate you're actually going to be with the torpedo. You know, if you want to make that sure shot from 2 kilometers, kilometer and a half away, whatever it is, you actually want to be going a bit slower and not a bit faster. And that's a really interesting element to the gameplay because it's counterintuitive. In the planes, most of the time, you always want to be going as fast as possible. Watch any of RamJB's videos. You want to maintain that energy. However, in torpedo bombing, you need to do exactly the opposite if you want to maximize the accuracy of the weapon. How cool is that? Now, the last thing that I want to talk about, actually it's not quite the last thing, is the potential, as Baron discussed in his video, of sort of specialty units. So say the aircraft carrier. Imagine if you have an aircraft carrier which can launch AI units. So if you're the carrier driver, you basically have the option of launching, say, a flight of aircraft, 3, 4, whatever it might be. And you could then, like with the artillery bombardment screen, perhaps give those units waypoints, route them to a particular area, or just set them to be constantly above your aircraft carrier on a combat air patrol wherever you go. So you don't really need to spend too much time thinking about it. You can then focus on maneuvering the ship, sticking with the fleet and sticking with your protective units. Meanwhile, your little flight of AI aircraft are just going to be up there flying cap. Another specialty unit would potentially be these landing craft that I spoke about earlier in the context of the light carriers, the LSV and the LSD. Haha. Not quite sure how you would work those. You know, potentially you would launch some AI landing craft and use those landing craft as they work now to try to capture a coastal point, something along those lines. Not quite sure how fun that would be. Certainly, I think the combat air patrol or waypointed AI aircraft, that could potentially be an awful lot of fun. Certainly, if you're more of the sort of strategy-minded player. The landing thing, not quite so sure. Not really. You know, I'd like to see it experimented with. I'd very much like to see all of these possibilities toyed with to see how they can be integrated into the game. I'm just not entirely sold on the idea yet. So let's carry on with the final weapon type that I did want to sort of talk about. Not too much because it doesn't actually exist. That's depth charges. If there are submarines in the game, basically we need to have depth charges. Whether they're dropped by the ships or by aircraft like the PVYs, these are basically the sub-hunting weapon. Torpedoes might work, but depth charges, that's where it's at. With all that said about the weaponry, there are two massive gameplay systems that we need to take into consideration and have a little bit of a discussion about. The first is, and I did address this briefly before, the provision of a stable gun platform. Now, I think most people would just take it for granted that ships are a big, stable platform and that they don't really need to take that into consideration. Certainly, as it stands right now, that's what ships seem to be. There's no real wave movement action within the water's surface, and the ships sit very flat, they maneuver very flat, but in fact that's not how real ships work. And I'm just throwing in another little clip here. This is a frigate destroyer. I'm not quite sure exactly what kind of ship it is, but what we see here is a ship making a very hard turn to port, left. You'll notice that as the turn tightens, the ship is actually heeling quite sharply to the outside of the turn. Now, this you can already see this would have a very significant impact on the stabilization of the guns that you intend to fire, and that would be true of both the anti-aircraft guns and the big cannon batteries. In this, it looks to me like the ship's healing at maybe 10 degrees. I don't know, maybe I'm overestimating that, maybe it's only 5. But we're talking about gun batteries which have only 5 degrees of depression, in some cases less than that, maybe only 2 or 3 degrees of depression, and maybe 10, 15 on the outside, 20 degrees of elevation. If you throw randomly 5 or 10 degrees at those, you're basically never going to hit what you're aiming at. And since this is a mostly World War II game, we don't have the powerful computerized gunnery software that could easily compensate for that sort of thing. In contrast, this is all stuff that we are going to have to manage ourselves. And I think that's a wonderful concept, because it makes the ships very much a fire or maneuver system. If you're maneuvering hard to avoid, say, an incoming dive bomber, you can't achieve that and have deadly accurate anti-aircraft gunnery at the same time. Likewise, you can't both maneuver and successfully shoot a bombardment target somewhere inland. You've got to do one or the other. You've got to choose the time that you fight, and you've got to choose the time that you're maneuvering. And that, to me, sounds like a fantastic game. I mean, just imagine it. You and your friends, you've got a couple of destroyers, you've gone as like a small squad, say 3 or 4 destroyers, you've scooted off very quickly, very close to the coast, gotten some significant distance sort of into the battle zone, let's say, and you've managed to catch a cruiser with its pants down. Right? Here's this guy that's been left behind, or what, you can imagine all kinds of different scenarios. You got a bunch of cruisers, you got a bunch of destroyers. You're against this quite powerful ship. Above you are a range of AI-controlled aircraft, some player-controlled aircraft. So you've got to watch the skies. You've got to watch this enemy ship, what he's doing, and you're trying to engage him. So you need to not stop, but every once in a while, when your guns are reloaded, when you have a sort of a brief moment of respite within all of the stuff that's going on, you've got to track straight and true, provide as stable a platform as possible to fire off the next battery at this target. If you don't do that, you might point your guns at the target and shoot, but you have an extremely high likelihood that, depending on which way you're turning, they're either going to significantly overshoot the target, or they're just going to splash into the sea, 500 meters in front of him. So all of this is stuff that you have to take into consideration just within the course of battle. And again, I find that whole concept quite exciting. It ties in very closely with the other significant or major consideration, which is the damage modeling. And that's something that's going to have to change. As it stands now, a ship is just basically a single box-like object with hit points. Even planes, or not even, but I mean the planes have a much more expanded damage model than that. We have different hitboxes, different systems, onboard systems. So you've got your engine, you've got your pilot, you've got gunners, you've got fuel tanks that can ignite and explode. The wings, the tail, all of these different places, different surfaces. That's all going to have to be integrated in a similar way into the naval combat. Now, the big thing for me, and this may make some people rage, I don't know, but the big thing for me is that I would like to see is no respawns. Essentially, it doesn't really make sense for me in the context of naval combat, these big, powerful, heavily armored weapons platforms. They're not even individual weapons, they're platforms for other weaponry. And the idea of having a hangar or a port where you can queue up 5 or 6 different ships and you just respawn them as you die, It just doesn't make that much sense to me. I would much rather see a naval combat that really expands on the damage modeling, and instead of respawns, gives us damage control systems. So you would have a number of damage control teams that would vary from ship to ship. You have all of this locational damage. You know, your engine room can be damaged, your bridge can be damaged, an enemy bomb or some kind of hit might take out a gun battery. And instead of just having a ship that runs out of hit points, then sinks, and you move on to the next ship, part of the systems that you need to manage within your game is repairing damage, keeping in the fight, or keeping maneuvering. Your priorities might change through the course of the battle. It might be vital for you at one point that you get the engine up and running again so that you have some capacity to maneuver, and it may not be as important at that particular moment that you restore your 8-inch guns back to life again, or vice versa. And this would be true of arcade battles, of historical battles, and of full real battles. You would just get the one ship. You can balance it in a variety of different ways. So, for instance, in arcade battles, okay, you might only get the one ship, but maybe you can choose from your port or your dock of your collection of ships, basically, after the round has already started. So a system that's a little bit different to what we see now in historical battles with the aircraft. Right now you have to choose an aircraft from your hangar, and then you're basically rolling the dice on which map you're playing. Maybe with the naval combat, that could work differently in arcade, that you see the map and then you decide, oh, okay, I'm going to play this particular ship. Then you get into the historical battle, and maybe it works the same way that planes does. So you don't know exactly what you're going to get. You're selecting your ship before the map starts, and then basically you have to roll with what you've chosen. It might not be the ideal map for the ship that you chose to go in with, and you've just got to figure out how you're going to work it. That's part of the fun of the historical battle, is ending up in a float plane on a map that has no place to land one. In addition to that, you can include other systems. So, for instance, in arcade battles, the damage control might be more automatic. It might happen much more quickly. So, it's like arcade battles are now. It's a much more forgiving system. So instead of allowing you to respawn, you can basically sail around and you can do your thing, and you don't have to micromanage so much all of the different damage control systems and all of the weapons systems and the provision of stable gun platforms and all that kind of stuff. It's a bit more entry level, let's say. I don't want to be too disparaging. But then by the time you get into the historical battles, it's already significantly more difficult. There's much more stuff that you have to constantly be aware of, that you have to be constantly monitoring and managing in order to make the most out of the vessel that you're a part of. If you don't want to play that way, there could still potentially be alternatives. We've talked very early on about the patrol boats, these PT style boats. If you want a naval combat game that's a bit more fast and furious, a bit more action-packed, maybe that's your alternative. A very fast, very maneuverable little torpedo patrol boat that you're scooting in and out. It's incredibly hard to hit. You've got aircraft that are chasing you, but you keep making these tight turns. You've got destroyers or other enemy ships that are trying to engage with you, but again, they can't get good firing solutions because you're maneuvering so damn quickly. But you also have far fewer systems that you need to manage and that you need to sort of be aware of. You've maybe got a couple of 50 caliber anti-aircraft guns, an engine, a hull, just a much smaller variety of systems and a smaller crew capacity to deal with those things. Now, I can perceive a few potential problems. not so much in arcade, but say, for example, if you go into a historical battle and the planes get 1 life and the tanks get 1 life and the ships get 1 life. It does seem possible to me that that could very quickly degenerate into just a naval combat game, because the player-controlled aircraft are potentially going to be knocked out of the game first. Eventually the tanks are going to be knocked out, and the ships would be the last players standing. Mostly because they're the most durable vehicles within each game. So some kind of system is going to have to be put in place, and I've been trying to think about this. Hey, if you guys have ideas for this, I would love to see it in the comments or on the Reddit thread. I'm not quite sure how we'd manage that. Some ideas that I've been toying with in that regard would be, say, as long as you have an aircraft carrier that's still available in the game, maybe the aircraft players could respawn with the one plane that they chose. So it would be something like the backup plane, only it wouldn't be controlled by Lions or by Golden Eagles, but would be controlled by the circumstances within that map. Certainly something like that would make an aircraft carrier a really, really important target. I mean, if you don't take this thing out, it's just going to potentially, maybe not endlessly, maybe only 1 backup plane or 2 backup planes. I don't know, but here's this object that can be throwing out new aircraft at your team. You're going to want to deal with that, and deal with it quite quickly. So that's for historical battles. For the full real battles, I think something really different is going to have to be instituted. I cannot conceive of a way in which you can have a combined arms full real battle, in which, so essentially you would not have time or distance compression, and yet you're still having these big, slow, lumbering ships trying to be in the same game as fast aircraft. I just don't see it working. I'm inclined to think that if we're going to keep this full real battle system, that it should probably be field specific. So the full real battle aircraft players would be playing a game that's very much like IL-2 Sturmovik. They would be flying against other aircraft. The ground combat full real players will be flying, or will be essentially playing against other ground combat units. And the full real players could likewise have a game which is more of their own, which I think is essential, because if you think about it, in terms of the air combat, you can be a pilot, you can be one person in a plane, or even one person in a plane with a couple of gunners, and have that full real experience. Similarly, you can be a 2-man or a 3-man tank crew and have something that's like a full real experience. I just don't see how you can then incorporate these ships with crew complements sometimes into the hundreds, possibly even 1,000, 1,200 some of these carriers had. How can you be a crew of 1,000 people and yet still have something that's a full real experience? To minimize that and to get the best full real experience that's possible within the context, I think you basically have to remove the tank players and the air players from that consideration, and then just focus on giving the naval full real players the best experience that's targeted at them. You can also use that as sort of a test ground, although I don't want to be thinking about the full real players as something like lab rats, but you can use it as like a test ground for strategy and for doctrine, let's say. Have these full real players really develop the systems that are necessary to deliver the best kind of naval combat, and then roll that back into the historical battle and the arcade battle experience to give those players, again, the best feeling experience that they can have within that big combined arms framework. And I'd be kind of curious to know if anybody knows of a single battle within the Second World War in which all 3 fields were covered, where there was both significant ground combat and significant air combat and significant naval combat, all incorporated within the structure of a single battle. Because, frankly, I can't think of any. I can think of plenty of pairings of the two. In the Battle of the Bulge, you've got aircraft and ground units. In the Battle of Midway, you've got naval units and air units. There's plenty of combinations that include 2 out of the 3, but frankly, I cannot think of a single one in which all 3 of them are participating in this more or less equal, balanced kind of way. And I would be very curious to know if that even exists at all. Because if it doesn't, and yet you combine all of these 3 fields into this single theatre of combat, then I don't really see how you can claim that as being a full real experience at all. Anyway, that does it for me. We've covered an awful lot of ground, and we're now pushing an hour. Thanks for sticking with me if you did. If you didn't, well, bugger you lot. That's me done. Told you I could ramble on. Do you believe me now? Do you? Huh? See ya.